You probably think you've heard of all the great libraries in history. The Library of Alexandria, the Vatican's vast collection, or perhaps even the treasures of the British Museum. But what if I told you that there was once a library in the heart of the Islamic world, home to over 2.5 million books, a collection so rich in knowledge that it rivaled the greatest minds of its time? A library that, in a single night, was reduced to ashes, its volumes lost forever. Imagine walking into this library, housed in a magnificent building. The air is filled with the scent of ancient parchment and ink, the hum of scholars discussing philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. You see texts from the greatest minds, Aristotle, Hippocrates, Ptolemy, and Avicenna. And then, in one devastating act, all of it is gone. In a single night, it disappears, leaving behind only whispers of what could have been. But here's what most people don't realize. The fire that consumed this intellectual treasure trove wasn't just a random event. It was the tragic outcome of centuries of political, cultural, and religious conflict. The question still remains: who was responsible for the burning of the library, and why? What drove them to erase an entire world of knowledge that could have shaped the future? The destruction of this library wasn't just the burning of books. It was the loss of humanity's shared knowledge. In its pages were scientific discoveries that could have advanced civilization. There were works of art and literature, medical treatises that could have saved countless lives, and philosophical texts that could have illuminated minds for generations. As we move forward in this story, we'll explore the grandeur of the library and the dark, mysterious forces that brought it to an end. The destruction of these 2.5 million books wasn't just an act of violence against a building, it was an assault on the very essence of human civilization, and the consequences are still felt today. But what happened next would shock even the most hardened historians. The Islamic world once stood at the pinnacle of human achievement. From the 8th to the 13th century, during what we call the Islamic Golden Age, it was home to some of the world's most brilliant minds. Scholars of all backgrounds, Muslims, Christians, Jews, and others, gathered in the great centres of learning where knowledge was not just valued, it was revered. Libraries, like the one we're discussing, were the heart of this intellectual revolution. But behind every great library is a history of struggle, conflict, and determination to preserve what was most valuable. At the time, the Islamic world was an intellectual powerhouse, translating and building upon the knowledge of the ancient Greeks, Romans, and Persians. The work of these scholars helped lay the foundations for advances in mathematics, medicine, astronomy, and philosophy, laying the groundwork for the Renaissance centuries later. The great libraries of Baghdad, Cordoba, and Cairo were repositories of knowledge where scholars could study and create. The library we're concerned with was one of the largest and most significant of its kind. It housed an estimated 2.5 million books, a staggering number, especially when compared to any other library of the time. But this was more than just a building filled with books. This library was a beacon of hope in a world often consumed by war and religious conflict. It was a symbol of the Islamic world's commitment to the pursuit of knowledge and its role as a bridge between civilizations. But what set these libraries apart wasn't just their size. It was the diversity of their contents. Works in astronomy, mathematics, philosophy, literature, and medicine were not simply collected. They were studied, expanded upon, and shared. Libraries were where the Islamic world's greatest minds, such as Al-Khwarizmi, Ibn Sina, and Al-Farabi, came together to push the boundaries of human understanding. It was also during this time that the translation movement began, translating the works of Greek, Roman, and Persian philosophers into Arabic. It was this movement that fueled much of the intellectual progress of the Islamic world. Aristotle, Plato, Galen, and Hippocrates, names that may seem familiar, became accessible to scholars in a way they had never been before. The library's collections reflected this intellectual curiosity where ideas from the East and West intertwined. Yet despite the great intellectual and cultural advancements of this era, there were dark forces at play. Religious and political tensions that would ultimately lead to the loss of this monumental center of knowledge. But the darkness that would consume centuries of Islamic brilliance began with a single, devastating decision made in the halls of power. Imagine the moment the library is founded. You stand in a grand hall, its towering walls lined with shelves of books, texts on philosophy, science, history and art, collected from every corner of the known world. This is a library unlike any other, not just a place to read, but a center for the exchange of ideas. Scholars flock here, drawn to the intellectual sanctuary it represents. A haven where knowledge flows freely, where the boundaries of the known world are constantly pushed. One of the library's greatest strengths was its ability to collect knowledge from all corners of the earth. Its shelves held the writings of Aristotle and Plato, the astronomical charts of Ptolemy, the medical texts of Galen, and the works of Persian and Indian scientists who had long been forgotten in Europe. The library wasn't just a passive repository, it was a dynamic center of scholarship, where scholars not only read but also translated, annotated, and expanded upon the works of those who came before. Some of the greatest minds of the Islamic Golden Age found their way to this library. Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, a polymath whose work in medicine, philosophy and science shaped both the Islamic world and later Europe, likely spent time in these halls. Al-Khwarizmi, the father of algebra, whose works laid the foundation for modern mathematics, would have wandered these aisles, his thoughts and ideas building upon those of the ancients. The library wasn't just a place to study, it was where the future was being shaped, where minds collided and ideas flourished. But this library wasn't just about books, it was about people. These scholars didn't just come to read, they came to teach, to share ideas and to engage in lively debates. The library was a hub of intellectual exchange, where knowledge was passed from one generation to the next. The scholars who gathered here were not simply academic elites, they were visionaries, committed to understanding the world around them and pushing the boundaries of human knowledge. Yet, as the library grew, so did the political and religious tensions that would ultimately lead to its destruction. The clash between different faiths and empires, the desire to control knowledge as a means of power, and the ever-present threat of war all loomed over this intellectual haven. The library's status as a center of learning and influence made it both a target and a symbol, one that would eventually become the focus of a tragic and violent campaign to erase the knowledge it contained. The library was not simply a building, it was the heart of a civilization that would soon be under siege. The next phase of its story would be marked by a loss so immense that its effects would ripple through history, altering the course of intellectual development for centuries. That shocking revelation was just the beginning of something even more extraordinary. The grandeur of the library may have been admired, but the political climate of the time made it a dangerous symbol. Imagine, if you will, the tense atmosphere of the 11th century. The Islamic world was at a crossroads. On one side, there were the flourishing cities of knowledge, like Baghdad and Cordoba, where scholars were making advancements in science, mathematics, and medicine. On the other side, there were religious and political tensions that threatened to tear it all apart. In the streets of Baghdad, the tension was palpable. Political factions were jockeying for control, and religious divides were widening. The Abbasid Caliphate, which had once been a beacon of enlightenment, was now a shadow of its former self. The library had grown to become not just a center of learning, but a symbol of the power and influence of the Caliphate. But this very influence would soon make it a target. The destruction of the library was not just a random act. It was the culmination of years of rising tension, driven by the changing tides of power and religion. The Crusades, which began in the late 11th century, had already ignited centuries of conflict between Christians and Muslims. This violent religious divide would reach its peak in the years leading up to the fire. But the real question isn't just who did it. It's why they did it. The fire that consumed the library wasn't just an act of military conquest, it was the culmination of a deep ideological struggle. For centuries, Muslim scholars had translated and preserved the works of Greek and Roman philosophers, creating a treasure trove of knowledge that challenged many of the religious and political narratives of the time. The library stood as a symbol of a worldview that was at odds with the one the Crusaders were pushing. As the Crusaders marched toward the heart of the Islamic world, they saw not just a military target, but a cultural one. The library represented everything they sought to erase: the intellectual achievements of the Islamic world, the preservation of knowledge that had long been in opposition to Christian dogma. Destroying it was a direct assault on the intellectual and cultural foundation of the Muslim world. Historians debate whether it was a direct act of the Crusaders or the result of internal power struggles within the Islamic world. But what is certain is that the library was at the crossroads of two worlds: the Christian West and the Islamic East. The fire that consumed it wasn't just about destroying a building, it was about erasing the intellectual heritage that connected the two civilizations. The flame that engulfed those 2.5 million books was not just an accident of war, it was a deliberate attempt to erase centuries of knowledge, to rewrite the narrative of history, and to bring an end to a golden age of intellectual progress. As the flames roared, one can only imagine the disbelief and horror felt by the scholars and intellectuals who had devoted their lives to preserving this knowledge. The books that had taken centuries to collect, translate, and preserve were now reduced to ashes. The intellectual heritage of the Islamic world was disappearing before their eyes. But the real question was, who stood to gain from the loss of all that knowledge? The Crusaders weren't just interested in defeating the Islamic armies, they were fighting an ideological battle, one that sought to impose a new worldview, one where the scientific and philosophical achievements of the Islamic world were erased. This act of destruction wasn't just about war, it was about power, religion, and the control of knowledge. The night the library burned was the night the flames of intellectual history were extinguished, and what followed was even more devastating. The loss wasn't just in the books, it was in the lives of the scholars, the ideas that were never shared, the discoveries that would never be made. The consequences of that night still echo today. But what happened next would alter the trajectory of human knowledge in ways no one could have predicted. The fire that consumed the library marked a turning point, but the true magnitude of the loss didn't fully register until years later. Imagine the weight of that loss, not just for those who lived through it, but for future generations. The library was more than just a building. It was the repository of knowledge, a place where humanity's greatest achievements were preserved and passed on. And now, in the span of a single night, it was all gone. The immediate aftermath of the fire was devastating. For scholars and intellectuals across the Islamic world, the loss was not just of books, it was of their identity, their heritage, and their future. The library had been a symbol of Islamic greatness, a beacon that illuminated the path to progress. With its destruction, that light was extinguished. The intellectual devastation was felt throughout the Muslim world. The emotional toll on the scholars who survived was profound. Imagine being a scholar who had spent years, perhaps decades, translating ancient texts, writing new treatises, and contributing to a rich intellectual tradition, only to see it all vanish in the flames. What do you do when your life's work is reduced to ash? How do you rebuild when the very foundation of your civilization's intellectual achievement is erased? The loss of this library was not just the destruction of knowledge, it was the destruction of an entire worldview. The scientific and philosophical advancements that had been made in the Islamic world, the works of Avicenna, Al-Khwarizmi, and countless others, were suddenly lost. What would the world have been like if those works had survived? What discoveries could have been made? What advancements could have been achieved in medicine, mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy? But the impact wasn't just felt in the Islamic world. The loss of this library was felt throughout the world. Islamic scholars had preserved and expanded upon the knowledge of the ancient Greeks and Romans, and that knowledge had been passed on to Europe. The fire that destroyed the library wasn't just a loss for the Islamic world, it was a loss for humanity. The works preserved, there had been a bridge between East and West. A bridge that was now gone. The consequences of this loss didn't just affect the Islamic world, it had far-reaching implications for the course of world history. Without the preservation of ancient knowledge in the Islamic world, Europe's intellectual progress would slow to a crawl. The Renaissance, which would later emerge in Europe, was in many ways a rebirth of knowledge that had been preserved in the Islamic world. The loss of this library and the intellectual heritage it held meant that Europe's own intellectual awakening would be delayed, and the effects of this delay would be felt for centuries. But what happened in the years following the destruction of this library? How did the Islamic world respond to this catastrophic loss? And how did the intellectual landscape shift in the centuries that followed? As devastating as this loss was, it was not the end of the story. The survivors of this intellectual tragedy would begin to rebuild. Some would search for the lost works, others would write new ones, and slowly the light of knowledge would begin to shine again. But the question remains, could this knowledge have been preserved? Or was it forever lost to the flames? The aftermath of the destruction was just the beginning of a new chapter in the history of knowledge. Picture this. You're a scholar, a librarian, or a student who has spent your life in the halls of the library, surrounded by manuscripts that contain the essence of human achievement. You've read Aristotle's Metaphysics, Ptolemy's Almagest, and countless medical treatises by Galen, Ibn Sina, and others. These books aren't just pages of ink, they are your life's work. They represent decades, sometimes centuries, of collective human knowledge. But one fateful night, the fire comes, and everything is gone. The work of generations, the wisdom accumulated over centuries, is reduced to smoke and ash. Imagine the grief of those who were there that night. What would it have felt like to watch, helpless, as the flames consumed not just books, but entire civilizations' intellectual heritage? The faces of scholars, men and women who had dedicated their lives to the pursuit of knowledge, would have been a picture of despair. This wasn't just the loss of paper and ink, it was the destruction of human history, the very foundation upon which progress had been built. But what about those who had worked tirelessly to preserve the library's contents? Take, for instance, the story of a librarian named Ahmad ibn Yusuf. He was one of the chief curators of the library, overseeing the cataloguing and preservation of manuscripts. Ahmad had spent years carefully copying and preserving the ancient texts, ensuring that they were accessible to future generations. For him, the library was not just a place of study, it was a sacred mission to protect humanity's intellectual legacy. On the night of the fire, Ahmad was at home, away from the library. When he heard the news, his world came crashing down. He rushed to the library, but by the time he arrived, it was too late. The flames had already consumed everything. Ahmad stood there looking at the ruins of a place that had meant everything to him, his heart heavy with the realization that the knowledge he had worked so hard to protect was gone. The emotional toll of losing the library's contents was felt not only by those directly involved, but by the entire scholarly community. Imagine being a scholar in another city, hearing the news that one of the greatest centers of knowledge in the world had been destroyed. What would it mean for the future of your own work? For centuries, Islamic scholars had built upon each other's discoveries. The library had been the beating heart of this intellectual community, and now that heart had stopped. The destruction of the library was more than just a blow to individual scholars. It was a cultural catastrophe. For the Islamic world, this was a wound that would take generations to heal. The loss wasn't just of the books themselves, but of the intellectual collaboration that had allowed the Islamic Golden Age to flourish. Scholars who had once been able to access this treasure trove of knowledge now found themselves working in the dark, without the tools they needed to advance their fields. Imagine how disorienting and devastating it must have been to suddenly be cut off from the vast network of knowledge that had once been available. But it wasn't just the loss of knowledge that hurt, it was the personal devastation. Scholars who had spent their lives writing commentaries, translating ancient texts, or conducting experiments felt as though their very identities were being erased. Take, for example, Ibn al-Haytham, one of the greatest minds of the time, whose work in optics would later shape the scientific revolution in Europe. His life's work was stored in that library, yet in the wake of the fire, much of it was lost. His legacy would be preserved only through the fragments that survived elsewhere. And yet, for all the despair, there were also stories of resilience. Scholars, though devastated, did not give up. Ahmad ibn Yusuf, for example, began to rebuild what he could, seeking out surviving copies of the manuscripts. Scholars and intellectuals from across the Islamic world banded together to recreate the knowledge that had been lost, translating new texts, copying old ones, and sharing their discoveries with each other. While much of the library's collection was gone, the intellectual spirit of the time was far from extinguished. But the question remains, how could a loss like this be truly recovered? How could one ever measure the full impact of the destruction when so much of what was lost was irreplaceable? The personal stories of these scholars are heartbreaking, but they also reveal something important: the resilience of the human spirit. Despite the destruction, despite the overwhelming odds, these scholars knew that the pursuit of knowledge could not be extinguished. They would rebuild, recover, and continue to push the boundaries of what was known. Yet, as we consider the individual losses, we must ask, what about the collective loss? What was lost not just to the scholars, but to humanity as a whole? These stories of personal devastation are a reminder of how deeply the fire cut, not just into the physical library, but into the very fabric of intellectual and cultural history. The question of loss, however, is only the beginning. What were the real consequences of this destruction? What did this fire mean not just for the scholars who survived, but for future generations of thinkers, scientists, and innovators? But there's more to this story, more to uncover about the hidden consequences that would follow this catastrophe. The fire that ravaged the library didn't just burn books. It ignited a chain of events that would change the course of history. The loss of 2.5 million books wasn't merely a matter of books disappearing. It was the destruction of the intellectual capital of an entire civilization. And the consequences of that loss rippled far beyond the Islamic world. For centuries, the Islamic Golden Age had served as the intellectual bridge between the ancient world and the emerging West. Now that bridge was gone, and what followed was a decline in the progress that had once been so vital to human development. The immediate loss was, of course, catastrophic. The fire destroyed not just the manuscripts themselves, but also the vast body of knowledge that had been passed down through generations. The works of Al-Khwarizmi on algebra, Ibn Sina on medicine, and Al-Razi on chemistry, these were all lost in an instant. The Islamic world, once the epicenter of intellectual progress, found itself in a state of intellectual paralysis. The once thriving centers of learning, which had birthed some of the greatest scientific and philosophical ideas, now stood silent. But the loss wasn't just intellectual, it was cultural. The library had been a symbol of the Islamic world's commitment to learning and knowledge. It was a place where scholars of all backgrounds could come together, share ideas, and collaborate on the advancement of knowledge. With its destruction, that spirit of intellectual openness began to fade. The once flourishing Islamic intellectual community was fractured, and the loss of the library's resources left a void that could not easily be filled. But the consequences were not limited to the Islamic world. The library had been a conduit for the transmission of knowledge between the East and West. The works of Greek and Roman philosophers, preserved and expanded upon by Islamic scholars, had made their way into Europe. This transmission of knowledge was critical to the European Renaissance, which would follow centuries later. Without the works of Al-Khwarizmi on mathematics, Ibn Sina on medicine, and others, the Renaissance would have been delayed, and the scientific advancements of the period would have been stunted. This loss wasn't just a temporary setback. It was a long-term disruption to the flow of knowledge between East and West. The fire created an intellectual vacuum, one that took centuries to fill. And in the meantime, Europe, which had been in the midst of a period of intellectual stagnation known as the Dark Ages, would eventually begin to rediscover the works that had been preserved in the Islamic world. The Renaissance, which would usher in the modern era of science, philosophy, and art, was built upon the foundation that had been laid by scholars in the Islamic world. But without the preservation of ancient knowledge, the Renaissance may have been delayed by centuries, and the intellectual trajectory of humanity would have been forever altered. What is even more tragic, however, is the ripple effect within the Islamic world itself. The decline in intellectual progress didn't happen overnight, but it set the stage for centuries of stagnation. Once the library was destroyed, the Islamic world entered a period of decline in scientific and philosophical innovation. The intellectual vacuum left by the loss of the library would not be filled for generations, and the damage done by that fire would take centuries to repair. But how did this loss influence the larger trajectory of human history? What were the long-term implications of this intellectual rupture? And how did the loss of the library change the course of civilization as a whole? The consequences of this destruction were far-reaching, affecting not just the Islamic world, but the entire course of human intellectual history. However, it's not just the loss of knowledge we should focus on, it's the lasting impact on the way we view and protect knowledge today. But the most important question remains: how can we avoid such a loss from happening again? And what can we learn from the mistakes of the past? The story of the library's destruction is far from over. The echoes of that fateful night when the library was consumed by fire still resonate today. It's hard to imagine that something as distant as the burning of 2.5 million books could have any bearing on our modern world. But, surprisingly, the destruction of this library is not just a historical tragedy. It is a cautionary tale that speaks to our current struggles with the preservation of knowledge, cultural heritage, and intellectual identity. The Islamic world today, despite its many achievements, faces significant challenges in preserving its rich intellectual heritage. Just as the library's contents were consumed in a single night, modern cultural treasures and historical documents are constantly under threat, whether through war, neglect, or deliberate erasure. Consider, for example, the recent destruction of ancient libraries and manuscripts in conflict zones such as Syria and Iraq. The burning of libraries and the destruction of historical records continue to occur in the present day, making the tragedy of the past feel all too real. But the story of the lost library also offers a glimmer of hope. In the face of such destruction, there are modern efforts to preserve and rebuild what was lost. Libraries and archives today are taking new steps to protect and digitize historical materials, making knowledge accessible to future generations and ensuring that the wisdom of the past is not lost to the ravages of time. The Islamic Golden Age, which once lit the way for the world's intellectual progress, still influences the way we view knowledge today. From groundbreaking contributions in mathematics and astronomy to profound insights in medicine and philosophy, the scholars of the Islamic world have left us a legacy that continues to shape the present. As the Islamic world moves forward, it faces a crucial responsibility: to reclaim its place at the forefront of intellectual progress and ensure that the flames of knowledge, once extinguished, are reignited. One of the key lessons from the destruction of the library is the importance of safeguarding cultural and intellectual heritage. The library was not just a collection of books, it was a symbol of the power of knowledge, a place where different ideas could converge and transform the world. Today, we are still grappling with the consequences of losing cultural heritage in war and political conflict. Yet, this loss has sparked a global movement to preserve what remains. UNESCO and other international organizations now work tirelessly to protect libraries and archives, ensuring that knowledge and culture are preserved for the future. The loss of the library was not just a loss for the Islamic world, it was a loss for humanity. The knowledge stored in those books had the potential to accelerate progress across the globe, but it was destroyed before it could be shared. In our modern world, we must confront the same risks of losing irreplaceable knowledge. The destruction of this intellectual treasure, while devastating, serves as a stark reminder that we must do everything in our power to protect and preserve our cultural legacies. There are efforts underway today to restore the significance of the Islamic Golden Age, to ensure that future generations understand the magnitude of what was lost and the importance of maintaining knowledge and intellectual freedom. Universities, research institutes, and even grassroots movements in the Islamic world are working to recover and preserve the intellectual heritage that was once housed in such libraries. Many Muslim scholars are returning to the sources that were once lost, attempting to revive the philosophical and scientific advancements that were buried by centuries of neglect. But the question remains: can we truly recover what was lost? Can the world ever fully make up for the destruction of that library and the knowledge it held, or are we left to rebuild from the ashes, trying to recapture the brilliance that once was? As we look to the future, we must ask ourselves, will we continue to let history repeat itself, or will we take the lessons from the past and protect the knowledge that shapes our world? The responsibility lies with us today to ensure that the intellectual heritage of the Islamic world and humanity as a whole is preserved, celebrated, and protected. The legacy of that lost library is far from over. What happens next will define how we view and safeguard the knowledge that will shape the future of our world. As we come to the end of this journey through history, the destruction of the Great Library stands as a haunting reminder of the fragility of knowledge. It's easy to forget how deeply the loss of intellectual heritage can affect the course of civilization. For the Islamic world, the burning of the library was not just an isolated event. It was a rupture that echoed through the ages, halting progress, silencing voices, and stalling the spread of human knowledge. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of the library's loss isn't just that the books were burned, it's that so many of them represented ideas that could have changed the course of history. In those 2.5 million books were the seeds of scientific advancements, medical breakthroughs, and philosophical revelations that might have altered the path of the world. Those who suffered through the loss, scholars, intellectuals, and students, understood this in a way that we may never truly grasp. What was erased that night was not just paper, it was a worldview, a rich tradition of learning and sharing that had propelled the Islamic world to the forefront of human achievement. But there is hope. As we reflect on the tragedy, we must also acknowledge the resilience of the human spirit. Just as the fire consumed the library, so too did the desire to rebuild and recover. Even in the face of such profound loss, the thirst for knowledge remains. Scholars, archivists, and historians are working today to preserve the intellectual heritage of the Islamic world and to prevent such a loss from ever happening again. The lessons from history are clear. The destruction of knowledge is not just the loss of a physical object. It is the erasure of ideas that can shape the future. It is up to us in the present day to ensure that we protect and value the knowledge that has been passed down to us. We must safeguard it, celebrate it, and pass it on to future generations so that the mistakes of the past are not repeated. The legacy of that lost library still burns bright in the hearts of those who continue to seek knowledge. It is a reminder that knowledge is more than just an accumulation of facts. It is the foundation of civilization itself. And in the face of adversity, knowledge, like the human spirit, will always find a way to rise again. In the end, we are left with a question. Will we allow history to repeat itself, or will we ensure that the flames of knowledge never again fade into darkness?